welcome back to Grim and Whim. Today we're going to be looking at a stranger than fiction case, and it's a case that has really baffled experts for decades. I mean, over 70 years. People in Australia and really just people all around the world were very just confused and wanting to know the mystery of the body that was found on Somerton Beach. Everyone wanted to know, who is this man who was found? What was his identity? What was he doing before he was found on this beach and found dead? And what terrible fate befell him? So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this mystery because it is a doozy. And I'm gonna do my best to simplify it so that way it won't be, an hour-long video, because there really is a lot of information. Like I said, people had been looking into this case for decades. And so let's go ahead and we'll hop in. The year is 1948 in Adelaide, which is the capital city of South Australia. And it's a warm Tuesday evening on Somerton Beach. On November 30th, 1948, John Bain Lyons and his wife went for a stroll along Somerton Beach. And this was something that a lot of people enjoyed doing, enjoying the beautiful weather and the scenic view. They suddenly noticed a well-dressed man lying on the sand. His head was propped up against a seawall, and his legs were outstretched and feet crossed. He had a half-smoked cigarette hanging from his mouth, and the way he was positioned, it seemed like he was just sleeping peacefully, or maybe he was passed out drunk. But later that evening, another couple came across the same man lying in the same sleep-like position. And when they got a closer look, the woman of the couple noticed that his clothing was pretty odd for a night out on the beach. You would expect more casual wear or even a swimsuit, more beach-like wear. But he was wearing this really snazzy suit. The suit was immaculate, and he was wearing shoes that looked freshly polished. They actually looked brand new. And despite the fact that he was lying motionless on the ground with mosquitoes swarming around his face, the couple decided that he probably was just sleeping, and they ended up moving on. The next morning, John Lyons, who is the man from the first couple who noticed the man on the beach, he returned from a morning swim, and he saw on the beach a crowd of people that were gathered around the seawall. And this was the same seawall that he and his wife had seen the sleeping man the night before. He walked over and he saw that the man was still slumped in the same position, and his head was still resting on the seawall, his feet crossed. But it was clear now that this man was not sleeping. He was cold, and something was definitely off. 3 hours later, the body was taken to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, where Dr. John Barclay Bennett cited the time of death was no earlier than 2 a.m. It was also noted that the man likely died due to some sort of heart failure, and the doctors were also starting to suspect that perhaps he had succumbed to poisoning. There weren't any markings that showed that he had possibly been stabbed or beaten in any type of way. No gun, no gunshot. It didn't look like he had been strangled, and so people were starting to wonder, how exactly did this man die? And did he really die on the beach, or did he die somewhere else and then was transported to the beach? And that's sort of what they were trying to figure out. And they also were trying to figure out the identity of this man. Who was he? And the contents of the man's pockets were incredibly confusing and not exactly so helpful. They spread out all the items on the table, and there were tickets from Adelaide to the beach. There was a pack of chewing gum, matches, a pack of cigarettes, and 2 combs, but there was no wallet, no cash, and no identification of any kind. There were no tags on any of his clothing either. It was as if someone had meticulously cut them out, so that way there would be no way to identify who the clothes were from, and then also where the clothes came from. On one of the man's trouser pockets, there was this strange orange thread that had been used to neatly repair some kind of, tear or something in the pocket. And a full autopsy was then carried out the next day. And if you think the contents in this man's pockets are weird, just wait till we get to the state of his body, and it's even stranger. The medical team that was performing the autopsy, they were completely baffled by the state of this man's body. His pupils were smaller than usual, and a dribble of spittle had run down the side of the man's mouth, most likely because he was unable to swallow it in his state. His spleen was also described as being strikingly large and firm, about 3 times the normal size of a spleen, and his liver was also distended with congested blood. In the man's stomach were the remains of his last meal, which was some kind of pastry, and there was also a quantity of blood in his stomach. This suggests poisoning. However, there was nothing to show that there was any poison in his food, and despite repeated tests on both his blood and organs by expert chemists, there wasn't the faintest trace of any type of poison found in his system. The team was astounded that nothing had been found, and the cause of death was still very much left to mystery. More peculiarities about the man's physique were found, but it didn't really bring the team too much closer to identifying the man or his cause of death. His calf muscles were very high and very well developed. They were described as being very well pronounced. And although this man was in his late 40s, maybe 50s, he had the legs of someone who did a lot of strenuous activity. However, his toes were oddly wedge-shaped. One of the experts remarked that his toes suggested that he had been in the habit of wearing perhaps high-heeled or pointed shoes. So perhaps this man was a professional ballet dancer or some kind of runner or mountain climber, whatever his profession or his hobbies. His cause of death was still no closer to being discovered, and the state of his body and the contents of his clothing were just really asking more questions and not really providing too many more answers. The coroner, named Thomas Cleland, was left figuring out how a body could have all the symptoms of being poisoned, but yet no trace of poison is found. A very rare poison must have been used, one that could decompose quickly after the person dies, leaving no trace. And one of these poisons that they looked into, and I'm probably going to blow pronouncing this correctly, but I'm going to try anyway, strophanthine, and it is a rare glycoside derived from the seeds of these very specific African plants. And historically, the Somali tribes, they used this substance to poison arrows for battle and for keeping, outsiders away from their community. And the experts started to think, okay, maybe this, strange type of poison was used. But this is like the 1940s. How would anyone be able to access this kind of rare poison? It's not like they had the dark web or anything, or, really the means to be able to easily, travel to faraway lands. And stranger still is that despite extensive efforts to identify the man, it took a very long time for anything to be unearthed. They did a full set of fingerprints and they sent it all throughout Australia, and then they sent it all throughout the English-speaking world, but no one could identify the prints. And people flocked to this mortuary that the body was being held in Adelaide. And people were coming out in the hopes that maybe they could give, this man a name. They hoped that perhaps this man was that missing relative or friend who they lost years ago. But for decades, the man remained a John Doe, a nameless entity who met some kind of twisted fate. And as the investigation continued, it also widened the search area in an attempt to locate any abandoned personal possessions that the man may have had in his travels. They believe that because nobody in Adelaide was able to recognize the man, they began to theorize that perhaps he was from out of town and perhaps he ended up in Adelaide from his travels. Every hotel and dry cleaners, every lost and found and railway station for miles was searched to get some kind of clue about who this man was and why he was in Adelaide. On January 12th, 1948, the investigation team got a pretty big break. The detectives searching the main railway station in Adelaide were shown a brown suitcase that had been deposited in the cloakroom on November 30th. And the staff at the station couldn't really give them much details about the owner of the case. They really didn't remember, but the case's contents did provide some pretty helpful clues. In the case, there was a reel of orange thread that was identical to the thread that was used to repair the pocket of the trousers that the dead man was found wearing. And similar to the clothes that the man was found in, all the labels and tags were meticulously cut out, and there was only 3 items of clothing in the case that did give some kind of clue. Inside 3 of the items bore the name Keene or possibly T. Keene. And this lead seemed to be the best that they would get. But when they ran, Keene, through, their database, which, to be fair, in 1948, wasn't as extensive as what we have now, but nobody with that alias was found on any type of, travel records, immigration records. And so despite this awesome evidence, it kind of hit a dead end, and the investigation team was sort of confused, perplexed about where to go next. It seemed like every lead they followed seemed to not even scratch the surface. But soon the case was about to become even more bizarre. A cryptic clue was found in a small pocket sewn into the waistband of the dead man's trousers, and a scrap of paper with the printed words Tamam Shud or Tamam Shud. I'm not entirely sure, but it's a Persian phrase and it means finished. And authorities began thinking that maybe the man wasn't murdered. Maybe he took his own life. And maybe he wasn't a regular man. Maybe he was a spy. And not just any type of spy, a spy during the Cold War. And people began running with this theory because the words that were on this piece of paper, it actually came from, it's a book, and it's a poetry book, and I'm going to try my best with the pronunciation, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And this book of poetry was really popular in Australia during the war years. And authorities searched for months for this specific copy of book, the specific edition where this page was torn from. A man finally came forward with this book that his brother-in-law and him found. And on the back of the book was the faint impression of a phone number written in pencil. And they were able to, look up the number, and it was unlisted, but they did discover that it belonged to a young nurse who lived near Somerton Beach. The name of this nurse, as well as the names of the two men who brought forward the book, all of their names are protected, so we don't really know who they are, and the names have never been released to the public. But the authorities questioned the nurse about her connection to this book, and she did admit that she presented the book to a man that she had known during the war, and this man was named Alfred Boxall. And so the investigative team is like, awesome, we have this name now. We have a person, a name for this face that we've been trying to figure it out for, so long. But unfortunately, they did hit another dead end because Mr. Boxall was alive and well, and he still had the copy of the Rubaiyat that the nurse had gifted him. And just like that, the investigators were back to square one. For 70 years, this case remained one of Australia's most baffling mysteries. And because there weren't a ton of answers, people, kind of thought about their own theories about who this man could have possibly have been. Was he just a normal person who died while on the beach? Or maybe he was a Cold War spy, and maybe he was trying to protect some kind of information that he knew couldn't get out, and maybe he took his own life just to protect it. But one man was on a personal mission to solve this case, and his name is Derek Abbott. And Derek Abbott is a professor at the University of Adelaide, and he analyzed the Somerton man, his DNA, using hairs that were preserved when authorities made a plaster model of his face. And they actually exhumed the Somerton man's remains in 2021. And when they did this, Abbott, the professor, he teamed up with renowned forensic expert Colleen Fitzpatrick from the United States. And she is a brilliant brilliant person. And she was actually able to build an extended family tree using the little DNA that they had. They were able to narrow it down to one man, Carl Webb, and the man's living relatives were able to confirm his identity, and there were no death records for Carl. And so in a lot of ways, many people believe that they just cracked the case. Here's what we do know about this mysterious man named Carl Webb. He was born in 1905 in Melbourne, Australia, and he was the youngest of 6 children. One of his older brothers, Roy, enlisted in the Australian military in July 1940 before his death in 1943. Roy looks a lot like the Somerton man, so the family resemblance is definitely there and is strong. Carl married a woman named Dorothy Robertson in 1941. But 7 years later, Carl's body is found on Somerton Beach, or what we believe to be Carl's body. And Dorothy filed for divorce in 1951 on the grounds of desertion. She had no idea where Carl went, and not knowing whether he was dead or alive, she filed for divorce. So here we are now in the year 2023, and for decades, people from all over the world, but specifically in Australia, have been trying to figure out who the identity of this man is. And the case is not technically closed. So the discovery of evidence that pointed to this man's identity being Carl Webb, this was made in 2022. And, you know, despite the evidence pointing to Carl being the Somerton man, I did want to point out that as of right now, the South Australian Police and the forensic science team, you know, in South Australia, they have not officially verified Abbott's findings. And so as more testing continues to be done, and as they, you know, wait for the test results, and as they make a little bit more connections to Carl and the unknown man, they're going to get all that, you know, situated, and then they'll make, you know, their final verdict as to whether or not, you know, Carl really is the Somerton man. So perhaps by 2024, we will actually have, you know, the official, you know, yes, this is the Somerton man, 100% for sure. But for right now, it is still a little bit of a mystery, but they have made huge leaps and bounds progress in just the past couple years. Like I said, his body wasn't exhumed until 2021. And for 70 years, it was, you know, people were just on their own trying to figure out what exactly happened to the man and who he was. And so we're a little bit closer now. Hopefully by next year, maybe we'll have the case finally be closed, and this decades-long mystery will have some sort of conclusion. I hope that you enjoyed this story. I have loved looking into this story. It really is kind of a crazy rabbit hole, and I sort of had to pick and choose what information I wanted to include in this video, because honestly, you could do a multi-part series or like a documentary on this topic, because there really is just such a wealth of information. The science alone in the past, 5 years that has gone into this case is, I mean, it could fill a whole video, but all of the conspiracy theories and like the connection with the Cold War and all of that. It definitely, it's mind-boggling, and it's something that's very interesting. I like to learn about this kind of stuff. I love learning about history that isn't super well known. And I love when mysteries are solved. I love finding out, you know, the identity of a nameless person, you know, a John or Jane Doe. I think that it is so important to give those people their identity. And so I hope you like the case, and I will see you next time. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me. It's goodbye for now, but I hope to haunt you again soon.